Hello, and welcome to another vlog. For those of you who have not been watching the Paralympic Games, Canada currently has 10 medals, 4 of which are gold. This week's topic is inclusive education. As always, I'll be releasing a video on Thursday which talks more about that, so be sure to subscribe if you'd like to see that video. Today, there's 3 things that I'd like to talk about. First, I'd like to talk about my personal experience with inclusive education. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the elements of inclusion, that is, the factors that influence it. And I'd also like to talk about some of the guiding principles of inclusive education. So let's get started. Inclusive education basically means that all students are included in all academic activities, regardless of their abilities. Um, for me, that's exactly what happened. I was included in all of the academic activities alongside my peers. Um, but in order to make that happen, there were several accommodations that needed to be made to ensure that all of those activities were inclusive. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. To start off, um, the buildings that I was going to school in had to be accessible. Um, and so if they weren't, steps were always taken to make sure that my accessibility needs were met. Sometimes that was just a matter of installing a ramp or automatic buttons. Other times it was a matter of completely renovating a school washroom, because it was understood what the benefits of that were, not just for me, but also for future students. I also had a teacher's assistant who accompanied me on the bus and was available throughout the day in case I needed assistance with anything. One of the biggest challenges I had when I was attending public school, and that I still have now, is writing. My hand, because of my Duchenne muscular dystrophy, tends to get tired after writing for long periods of time. So to compensate for that, I was allowed to have a note keeper, and I was also entitled to have a little bit of extra time on tests and exams. Now, I rarely used either of those programs and supports, but just knowing that they were available if I needed them certainly took away some of the anxiety of going to school. But it wasn't just in the classroom where they accommodated for me. It was also in gym class, for example. My gym teachers did an amazing job throughout my 13 years of public education of ensuring that I was able to participate fully in gym class. They always found ways to adapt the activities so that I could participate. If we were playing floor hockey, they'd give me a hockey stick and they'd find a way for me to play. If we were playing dodgeball, I'd be on the dodgeball court with all of the other students. This also applied to field trips. They'd always make sure that I could participate in the field trips, which required a little bit of extra planning just to make sure that all of the venues and activities were accessible and inclusive. They even did this for the week-long Quebec trip in grade 9, which I really enjoyed. And they did the same thing for extracurriculars as well. They made sure that all of these extracurricular activities included me. So that doesn't just mean like the clubs and theater and things like that, but also uh, dances, the prom, safe grad, all of those academic activities were adapted to ensure that I could participate in them. Now, I didn't have any cognitive challenges that needed to be accommodated for. A lot of students with special needs do, but even without those, I still felt included. And for that reason, I want to really thank all of my past teachers for working so hard to make sure that that was possible, because it really made my education a lot more enjoyable and a lot more successful. And I think in a lot of ways it turned me into the person that I am today. And this is really important because there are a lot of people with special needs who don't always have access to that stuff. Um, and the whole reason I chose to talk about inclusive education this week is because I like to pick topics that I find are misunderstood, and I think inclusive education is one of those topics. A lot of people think that inclusive education means certain students getting special treatment. Um, but in reality, that's not the case. Students with special needs are given these kinds of supports because they need them to succeed, whereas able-bodied students don't usually need those things. And a lot of parents might be worried that their children might not understand that, but from my experience, able-bodied students understand that. None of my peers ever questioned why I had those supports because they understood why. So that brings me to the second thing that I want to talk about today, which is the factors that influence inclusive education. So there's 5 main factors that influence inclusion in the academic environment. These are class size, funding, resources, skills, and time. So I'm going to go over each of them quickly. So when it comes to class size, the smaller the class size, the more time the teacher can devote to each student, including the students with special needs. Um, Funding and resources kind of go hand in hand. The more funding and resources a teacher has access to, uh, the more they can do for their students, especially the students with special needs. Obviously, funding refers to money, but resources could be many different things. It could be medical equipment, assistive technology, educational materials, really anything tangible that's going to help a teacher educate his or her students and provide for his or her students with special needs. Um, and that's why it's so important that there is enough funding for schools so that the teachers can provide the supports to the students that they require. The next thing is skills. It's important for instructors to have the right skills to help students with special needs and all other students as well. The better skills a teacher has, the more easily they can respond to those changing needs. And then the last thing is time. Obviously, it takes a lot of time to provide these supports to students, especially students with special needs. And it's important to keep administrative tasks to a minimum so that the teachers can devote that time that they need to educating. Um, and I think that's something that a lot of schools are trying to do, but it's important that they do that so that teachers and administrators have the time to provide the education and supports to their students, especially the students who require them. So that's just a very quick rundown of the factors that influence academic inclusion. And that brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about today, which is I want to go over a little bit about the guiding principles of inclusive education. After doing my research this past week, I found that there's 6 main principles that make up inclusive education. So I'm going to go over those one by one. The first is a positive and supportive environment. Basically, by this, I mean an academic environment where everyone feels safe and feels like they belong. The next principle is a flexible, individualized curriculum, right? So the curriculum needs to be adapted to meet each student's specific needs, but it also needs to be flexible in that it can adapt and evolve as each student's needs change over time. And that brings me to the next thing, which is a little similar. The third principle is a wide variety of supports unique to each student. Um, Basically, what this means is providing the right programs and supports to each student to ensure that they're going to be successful in their studies and in their education. And the reason I say unique to each student is because those programs and services are going to vary from student to student. Some students are going to need a lot of support, others aren't going to need as much. It's not about intelligence, it's about needs. Needing a lot of supports doesn't mean that you're less intelligent than another student, it just means that your needs are different. And that brings me to the next thing. The next principle is a focus on equality and fairness, right? So this means that not only does each student have to have their rights respected, but also their needs. And proper steps need to be taken to fairly accommodate for each student's needs. Um, some students don't need supports, other students do, like I said, and it's all about ensuring that each student is successful. That's where the fairness side of things comes in. So if that means providing some extra support to a student so that they can be as successful as their peers, then that's the fair thing to do. The fifth principle is ongoing interdepartmental collaboration. So basically by this, I mean that different organizations and levels of government need to come together to make sure that the system works. Because when people don't work together, when different organizations don't work together, that's when the cracks in the system become visible, and that's when students fall through the cracks. And the last guiding principle is kind of similar to the fifth one. It's continuous community support. So basically, this means that the entire community needs to come together to make sure that each student's needs are met and that no student is left behind. This doesn't just mean teachers and principals, but also students and parents and the local community. They all need to come together to make sure that no child is left behind. So that's a very brief overview of the guiding principles of inclusive education. Watch this week's educational video on Thursday if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Um, I will say I did really find all the research that I did this week very informative, and I hope you've found this information as informative as I have. If you did enjoy this week's video, hit that subscribe button and also be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Anyway, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on Thursday.